Hello, my friends. This is Deepak again, and very lucky, very privileged, very honored to have Harish again, the author of these amazing books, The Recognition Sutras, Illuminating a 1,000-Year-Old Spiritual Masterpiece, and then Tantra Illuminated. And so I'm very thankful that Harish has agreed to participate in some commentaries on his work with us and our ecosystem. So before I start the conversation, I just want to give you a little background about why I'm doing this and what my intention is and what I think we can achieve by having these conversations with the great Harish Christopher Wallis, scholar, yogi, and an amazing writer as well. I've read these books and enjoyed them thoroughly. So a little bit of background for Harish as well, why I'm doing this, and for all of you. So, I started as a medical doctor and went into neuroendocrinology, which is the study of hormones, and then brain chemistry. And in my training, I got very involved in the early days on identifying what today we call the molecules of emotion, like serotonin and dopamine and opiates and oxytocin. And there's a new one now called anandamide, which is the molecule for bliss, identified by neuroscientists in the brain. So I was very excited about my work in the early 80s. And then I had the good fortune to meet my guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And this was now more than 45 years ago. And I was just navigating this field, mind-body medicine, integrative medicine, the molecules of emotion, immunomodulators, self-regulation, all of that from a scientific point of view. And then I met Maharishi and I got initiated and I got very close to him. So at one time, I was almost for 10 years with him all the time, whatever he was doing, in between doing my practice as well. So when I mentioned the molecules of emotion to him one day, he winked at me and he said, "They're not real." He said that there's no such thing. They're symbols of awareness. These molecules you're talking about, they're symbols of awareness. They're human constructs for modes of knowing and experience in human consciousness. And everything is nothing other than awareness, including those molecules and including your body and including what you call physical objects. They're all modified awareness, even the brain. And, I'd never heard that before. So I was a very young, 30-something old neuroscientist working with a potential Nobel laureate, president of the American Endocrine Society. And when he introduced me to these concepts, Maya, Leela, etc., it was very strange for me. And so I started hanging around scholars, Vedantists, Kashmir Shaivists, but most prominently Ayurvedic scholars. And, I became a student of Triguna, one of the greatest Ayurvedic teachers of all time. He's passed on in his 90s now, but he was an amazing physician. He could touch your hands and tell you everything about you, everything, past, present, and future. So he was a Jyotishi also. And he took me under his tutelage as well. So I never got to be a scholar. I met scholars like I'm meeting right now, Harish, and I always learned from them. I had a smattering of training in Sanskrit and Hindi when I was in high school. I didn't use it, and then came to America and lost it all. So bottom line, I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I do understand Sanskrit. I can read Devanagari. And however, the last 40 years, I've been a very diligent practitioner of yoga, all 8 limbs. I practice these days 6 hours of sadhana every day, okay, if I can. In between, I do these events with Harish and other luminaries. But my focus now, at my stage, 74, is only self-realization. I focus only on 3 things: seva, sadhana, and sangha. That's it. And this is part of the sangha. So why I'm doing this is I want to bring the best out of people that I admire, that I respect, but I'm not a scholar. Starting right there, I am a yogi though. I practice pratyahara, I do introspective awareness. I have a yoga teacher. I go 2 hours every week, twice a week, to learn pranayam. I've been trained in the secret doctrines of pranayam as well that are not found in books, etc. I do consider myself very much a yogi practically. And in total transparency, I've been through what is called the dark night of the soul. When I realized that Deepak Chopra is not an identity, that Deepak Chopra is a provisional identity that changes every moment. I went through fear. I went through loss of identity. And then as the awakening started, which it did, I went through both dark night of the soul, extreme dark night of the soul, fear of death of my identity, and then also liberation and awakening to see beyond that. And it was amazing, ecstatic, beautiful, lovely. I'm not in that place all the time, but I can be. Anytime I put my awareness back to source, I go back immediately and I can see through the veil of Maya, and I can play very happily in the creative play of consciousness that we call Leela. So this is a very important phase of my life right now. I've been through all the 3 ashramas before. This is the final one. And I meditate all at night on my death. I reflect on my childhood. I go back to the earliest memories. And I am 100% convinced that the current scientific model, based on a physicalist, materialist ontology, is not true. And yet we use it to create science right now. We are right now on Zoom, and we are using the scientific model. If only we could understand that our everyday reality is also a virtual reality, then we would expand science in consciousness, and that would actually create new technologies for us as human beings. As long as we understood that technology and science and the physicalist model are useful for creating technologies, but if we lose sight of the fact that we are already in a virtual reality, we will never be liberated to fundamental truth. So that's just an introduction. And now, if Harish, you have any comments before I start, I'd like to just get into the meat of this amazing wisdom and knowledge.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just one comment, I suppose, that a lot of people in mainstream culture are not really aware that the top philosophers in the world all admit that we can't know that the physicalist model is true. And just to define the terms a little bit, physicalist or materialist model is the view that matter is fundamental and consciousness is a mere accidental, even epiphenomenon of matter. Whereas the so-called idealist view or consciousness-only view is the view that consciousness is fundamental and that matter, space, and time are epiphenomenal to consciousness. That is to say, they're ways that consciousness manifests the content of its experience. And the top philosophers in the world all admit that we can't know on any sort of logical basis which of these is true, and that surprises people. Now, of course, the spiritual masters of Indian tradition tell us it's the consciousness only view. That's the one that's correct. But I'm just saying that the top philosophers in the world today at least admit that we can't know that the physicalist view is true, and yet most people in mainstream culture just go about as if it's certainly true, when in fact it's very much open to question by all the finest thinkers. And you might even say, well, why does it even matter whether consciousness is fundamental and or matter is fundamental? Well, it ends up mattering quite a bit, because a range of experiences become available to us when we see and cognize and realize that consciousness is what's fundamental to reality, and forms the fundament of reality. Experiences become available to us when we realize that are otherwise not available to us when we cling to the physicalist view of the world. And as you know, Deepakji, that the view that you cling to shapes the range of experiences that are possible for you, even when you don't realize you're clinging to a view. Most people cling to the physicalist view without even realizing they are, and that limits the range of possible experiences and insights they're able to have. So that's why I would say it actually matters quite a bit, and I think you agree with that.
I not only totally agree, I actually use the phrase consciousness matters, where matters is a verb and not a noun. Consciousness becomes the experience of matter. So in this context, I was going to dive directly into the book, but because of what you said, about 30 years ago, I came across a conversation between Rabindranath Tagore and Einstein that was recorded in 1930. Einstein was, of course, a big celebrity already. He won the Nobel Prize at that time for relativity. And Tagore was also well known, but not as well known, had won the Nobel Prize. And they met in Potsdam and they spoke about this very conversation. So today, what we are talking about in science is referred to as naive realism or scientific realism. So scientific realism or naive realism is based on the fact that the world we see is real, number one. That's why it's called realism. And second, naive, because you presume subject-object split already, and that's the scientific model, and you already presume that matter is fundamental. So nobody can argue that scientific realism is naive realism. And it's not even meant condescendingly. It's just a word, it's a term. So this conversation that they had in 1930, Einstein said to Tagore, there are two views of the world. One is the human view and the spiritual view, and the other is the scientific view. And so Tagore said, yeah, but the scientific view is of the scientific human being. And Einstein responded, well, that's my religion. And I loved it because, he admitted that it was his religion. And since then, I've been in debates with these physicalists, Nobel laureates included, and some of them in the past very contentious, and very, when I look back, I realized I was inappropriately contentious with militant atheists, but that's the past. And in these debates, this always comes up, okay? That consciousness is an epiphenomenon. But now the conversation is turning, by the way, amongst philosophers of science in the direction that you are speaking, that, naive realism is very good as a scientific methodology. But if we understand that naive realism is naive, and we actually understand that consciousness is fundamental, then we have these range of experiences that you are talking about. And so that's why I'm so grateful we're having this conversation. Okay, so let's begin I've been reading your book many times, and I keep also making notes to ask you questions. So I'm starting right now with chapter 1 from the Recognition Sutras, originally as expounded, I believe, by the students of Abhinava Gupta. We spoke about this last time, and now this amazing contemporary translation. So I start with the sutra here on page 42. And this is what I'm reading. To that end, to make it clear that the very divinity that is one's own self is the cause of everything. It can be reached through an easeful and direct path. It is the most worthwhile fulfillment possible. And then you follow that. It is taught awareness, free and independent, is the cause of the performance of everything, which I translate for myself as I am is the divine cause of all experience that we call existence. So please take us a little deeper.
Sure. Yeah. So the words you were reading just there are the words of the great master Kshemaraja, whose name means the king of contentment, and he was the foremost student and successor of the great Abhinavagupta, perhaps the greatest of all tantric sages, who was a scholar, sage, and yogi. And Kshemaraja composed these sutras to really succinctly sum up the non-dual consciousness-only view as it was practiced and taught and realized in Kashmir 1,000 years ago. And I just want to take a moment to emphasize that this is not mere intellectual philosophy. These considerations belong in philosophy departments in Western universities, or so it's thought. But in this context of India 1,000 years ago, these were actually articulations of the nature of reality based in direct non-conceptual experience. So the whole goal of the practice, right, is to actually suspend the conditioned thinking mind, if not dissolve it altogether, at least temporarily, and to experience reality unmediated, meaning without any filters, and just to experience it as it is, which of course is non-conceptual as well, because concepts always mediate between yourself and reality. So to experience reality directly, you have to experience it non-conceptually. And what these great masters did is they then tried to articulate in words after the fact what their direct experience had been. And that evolved over time into a very sophisticated philosophy. But it was a philosophy, and it is a philosophy 100% based on direct perception of the nature of reality, attained through yogic means, where the yogic means are to remove those filters and veils imposed by our conditioning. Now, of course, some people are going to believe this is not even possible, but to those people we say, give it a try before you conclude that. And so Kshemaraja articulates this incredible first sutra of the so-called recognition sutras, the sutras of the recognition school, or pratabhijna in Sanskrit. And this first sutra, just to give it to you in Sanskrit, because it's the power of the language is so great. Chitti swatantra vishvasiddhi hetuhu. Awareness, free and independent, is the cause of the performance of everything. Where the challenging word there to translate is the word siddhi, which some people know as meaning magical powers, but it also means accomplishment, performance, attainment. So what he's saying with this sutra is consciousness or awareness, using those terms interchangeably here. Awareness is is autonomous in its real nature. It's absolutely autonomous and free. And it is the cause of the performance of everything, meaning to say, manifestation of the qualia of experience and dissolution of that experience, whatever sort of experience one is having, manifestation of a different sort of experience, that consciousness itself is in every single moment manifesting, maintaining, and dissolving its own experience, its own world of experience, right? That consciousness is the source of all phenomena, because all phenomena are nothing but consciousness vibrating in a particular way. And we can, understand this in a very simple and easy way just by noticing the qualia of your experience. That means that what is your experience literally made of? Well, you can see colors, which are just frequencies of light. You can hear sounds, which are just frequencies of sound, right? The the vibrations moving through air and modifying air molecules, right? So everything that you can perceive as a vibration, sensation, sound, vision, it's all just different forms of vibration. Now, in the physicalist model, they're taken to be vibrations created by objects external to awareness and independent of awareness. But we actually, scientifically, philosophically, as well as spiritually, we have no reason to believe that that's true other than our cultural conditioning or programming. That is to say, what we do know for sure is that everything that appears within consciousness is a form of consciousness. And whether any of those appearances relate to anything that exists independent of consciousness is completely unknown. And again, even the best philosophers have to concede that point, and they do, albeit reluctantly, but they know they have to concede it. So the point here is that the teaching is, and again, you can think about this logically, but it's really about experiencing it directly, that everything is a manifestation of consciousness, and that consciousness engages in this divine act of creation, maintaining, dissolution, concealment, and revelation. So it's actually a five-fold act, according to the tradition. What is this concealment and revelation? Consciousness, as Alan Watts used to say, loves to play hide and seek. It conceals to itself the fact that it is the author of all its experiences. Consciousness pretends for a moment, right? That moment can last several lifetimes, but it pretends that it is not, in fact, the author of the totality of its own experience. And then experiences this longing to know the truth and reveals that truth to itself. And so that's the revelation, the act of revelation, that consciousness realizes, nothing has ever been happening this whole time except what I am manifesting as the qualia of my experience, right? So the formless ground of consciousness manifests as all form. Another way to say it is the formless, timeless ground of consciousness coalesces into form, into specifically the forms of experience, and then releases and dissolves those forms once again and recreates, rebirths its experience moment to moment to moment. So what's the point of this realization, you might ask? It's profoundly empowering, because in the ordinary way of thinking about reality, which this tradition says is mistaken, it's a cognitive error. You think that the world confronts you from without, that you're just a tiny, insignificant creature in this big, vast, uncaring world that confronts you from without and comes at you with all sorts of things that you have to navigate. And this world would essentially be exactly as it is if you weren't here to observe it. Now, if you examine all those propositions, you discover they're not based in anything other than our cultural programming, right? The idea or imagination of a universe that's independent of conscious observers turns out to be nothing but just that, an idea, an imagination. So when you have this realization that it's what you are, that consciousness is what you are, and consciousness is what's manifesting as all the qualia of experience moment to moment, it's profoundly empowering. So you realize that you're the source of your experience and that you can have any sort of experience you want. Now, I'm not talking really about magical thinking where you can just, now that I've realized this, I can reshape reality, according to my whim, and I can just, win the lottery or whatever. Not talking about anything so superficial, but something much, much deeper, much more fundamental, and much more powerful, which is you are not at the mercy of you're not the victim of circumstance. You're not at the mercy of reality. You can experience things in any way you want. And if you choose, you can discover that consciousness has inherent within it a capacity for joy, which is not contingent upon or dependent upon the objects of experience, the circumstances you're in. In other words, you can discover that ananda, or joy, is intrinsic to consciousness. It's an intrinsic property of consciousness. It's not dependent on circumstance. Happiness is. Happiness and pleasure are dependent on circumstance, but this innate joy can blossom in any circumstance whatsoever if you discover your true nature. So all of this is implicit in that first sutra, and we know that we're not over-interpreting here. We know that it's implicit in the first sutra because the author of the sutra tells us so himself. He says, I've designed this sutra to be amenable to all these different interpretations. And he himself gives 5 different interpretations of his own sutra. So he says that's how it was designed, to unpack layer after layer of meaning from it.
So
Consciousness. Yeah.
thank you for that. And let me respond to what you said. And then maybe we can go into the 5 different interpretations. But based on what you said right now, has been exactly my experience for the last 25 years. As I do my practice, my sadhana, I realize that every breath, every thought, every sensation, every perception, every interpretation of the perception is the ceaseless appearance and disappearance of what you just called qualia. And that when I experience that, and when I experiment my own self, so I can close my eyes right now, think of the Empire State Building, I see an image. Then I think of my mother, I see an image. Then I think of how I felt when I was sitting in her lap, and I can smell her skin and hear the songs from the Mahabharata and Ramayana that she sang to me. And I can just do this in awareness all the time. I look here, I look there. That's a snapshot. That's a snapshot of qualia. And the storyline is me in between the snapshots, which is my karma and memories and sanskaras, or whatever you want to call it, my interpretations, my cultural conditioning. And it goes back thousands of years. So there's a big challenge here to go see through the veil of all this. But I actually now have this experience that I can create an image and then create another image. And I need to go from this image to that image by first going back to source, which is formlessness. In fact, between every vritti, whether it's a sensation, a perceptual activity, a breath, are the 5 acts. You are seeing the birth of breath, you're experiencing it, you're seeing its dissolution, and then you're seeing a little pause of concealment, and then you're seeing resurrection. And that is happening with every vritti constantly. And I am then, through my conditioned mind, intellect, ego, my subtle body, or whatever we call it, which is part of actually myself too, I am creating a storyline from which I need to be liberated. So whatever you've said right now, it's total is my experience, 100%. I cannot believe that force fields, gravity, atoms, molecules, which in turn are human constructs, anyway, even sound is a human construct, right? Where is sound generated? In consciousness. Where is it experienced? In consciousness. Where does it dissolve? In consciousness. Where does it resurrect itself? Where did it conceal before the next event? Is all happening in me. So I 100% now know this truth from what you're saying as the only truth. But even today, despite all that is happening in my life, I get distracted. I mean, I get distracted and I start to step out of that feeling of immense joy, which is independent of happiness or sadness or whatever. And there are moments when I lose it. And so I have to go back to bringing my awareness back to awareness and understanding these 5 acts of Shiva that you just so beautifully described in every flashpoint of experience, because all it is a flashpoint. And in between these flashpoints is me, the formless. That is, and again, I was reading Tagore. He says, in this playhouse of infinite forms, I caught sight of the formless. And so my life was blessed. So, I have to constantly kind of myself work through experience from form to formless, and form being a phenomenon that I'm generating as the formless in between and in the phenomenon itself. Mm-hmm. So, you validated this for me right now so clearly. Can we talk about the 5 interpretations of this sutra as we complete our discussion? Because what you said previously was so enlightening, revealing, and joyful.
Yeah, thank you. And one important point, because this is so easily misunderstood by people, that they think that until they've had the experience we're talking about, and not only experience, realization we're talking about, they think it's a very kind of self-centered view, right? But that's a misunderstanding, as I'm sure you know, because the revelation and the realization is not that I as an individual am manifesting my reality. That's the New Age misinterpretation of this teaching. And the teaching's easily misunderstood in that way, because what it really is my true nature is not a separate individual after all. As you discovered in the dark night of the soul, it's initially horrifying to realize you've been investing so much in your individual separate identity, and it turns out it's nothing but a thought. It's nothing but a mental construct. And so the realization is that what I am is trans individual, right? It's transpersonal. It's the consciousness that manifests in and through all beings. So it's realizing yourself as God, but not on the level of the individual, because individuality is nothing but a thought. It's a much, much, much deeper level. And then once you realize yourself as trans individual consciousness, it's that which is manifesting every aspect and every moment of experience. And the realization of that truth is what causes the quality of experience to change so radically. And it's this that gets called by words like enlightenment, awakening, liberation, and so on. So I just wanted to make sure that was perfectly clear for the viewers, because I know. Yeah.
That I
Great.
is not an individual. I is the ground of being in which the individual is a temporary process, basically.
Exactly. A temporary process and an appearance, if you will. Yeah.
A vritti, a continuum of vrittis, right?
Yeah. And that everything that appears within consciousness is equally a manifestation of the one. So that's the kind of the other important piece to mention, that everything that appears is equally a manifestation of the one, as opposed to the more common view that some things are more divine than others, some things are more God than others. But in this spiritual tradition, God does not refer to a supernaturally good being. God refers to this trans individual consciousness, which makes possible the whole universe of experience, and indeed makes possible the whole universe, full stop. So it encompasses the whole, and everything that appears is equally an appearance of that. And this makes perfect sense once you've had the realization, but doesn't quite make sense to the mind. So it's
Yeah.
important to flag here that there are certain aspects of this that will not be understood correctly by the mind, and that's why we keep inviting our students to practice and to realize the truth in their own experience.
Yeah.
So,
Now, here's a
go ahead.
question, by the way, that I have before we proceed.
Mm-hmm.
Other sentient beings or animals, or they have their own experiences, right? A snake navigates through what we call infrared, a bat through the echo of ultrasound.
Mm-hmm.
What does the world look like to an insect with 100 eyes, etc., etc.? So, what we call the physical world is very much a species-specific perceptual experience, in our case, also given a
Mm-hmm.
storyline. But all these other species are also my vrittis, aren't they? Are they the vrittis in my, meaning the bigger I? They are vrittis in my own awareness, even other species. And that also includes avatars and luminaries like Jesus Christ and Ramana Maharishi or Buddha. They're all part of vritti in me. And
Mm-hmm.
therefore, actually, as you said, no vritti has privilege over other vrittis. At
Right.
this level,
Mm-hmm.
an insect with 100 eyes and Buddha and Jesus are equally projections. Is
Mm-hmm.
that fair to say?
Yes, although I think it would need there we need a little bit more nuance here, because this is so easily misunderstood as well. That, let's put it this way. The only truth to individuality is the truth of unique vantage point, meaning to say there's one consciousness looking out at the world that is its own body, but it looks out at this world through countless different pairs of eyes. And that's real. That's there really are different vantage points that consciousness has on itself. So, a simple way to say this is you are the one seeing from the vantage point that people refer to as Deepak, and I am the one seeing from the vantage point that people refer to as Harish. And those verbal handles are perfectly perfectly fine. But it's just the one seeing from these different vantage points. So from your vantage point, all these different animals, they are the way your consciousness manifests that experience. Of course, consciousness manifesting from the vantage point of a snake is having a radically different experience of itself than you seeing the snake. And they're equally valid in the sense that it's all beings that have any degree of consciousness are partaking in the one consciousness to whatever degree that they do, because some creatures have very, very tiny umwelt, as it's called in neurology. It's the range of possible experiences that being can have, right? Some beings can only perceive very, very little qualia, but still they're participating in the one universal consciousness to that degree, to a very small degree. And their world, their perception of the world is very different from ours, right? But there's no objective world separate from all these perceptions. There's only consciousness manifesting in the way that it does, according to this view. So yes, so all beings are equally manifestations of consciousness. From your point of view, there's no intrinsic difference between the Buddha and a snake, except that something called the Guru Tattwa. And the Guru Tattwa means that consciousness wants to reveal itself to itself. Consciousness wants to illuminate itself. So everything that is part of the process of consciousness realizing its own true nature comes under the heading of Guru Tattva, where Guru doesn't mean a person, doesn't mean a human teacher so much as all the modes by which consciousness reveals itself to itself, right? So from your perspective, even though the Buddha and a snake are equally a manifestation of consciousness, and one's not intrinsically higher or better or more divine than the other, at the same time, the Buddha might be part of the Guru Tattva for you, meaning to say, might be instrumental in consciousness waking up to itself in you and as you, whereas the snake might not be. Now, at another moment, maybe a snake is. Who knows? But that's a key difference that's what prevents this philosophy, if we want to call it that, from devolving into a kind of relativism or even nihilism, right? It doesn't do that because we acknowledge that even though everything is equally God, some things and some beings are more conducive to the realization that everything is God than others. So that's a fascinating paradox.
That's brilliant what you just said, and very revelatory what you just said. In my naive playfulness and imagination, since I understand that ultimate reality, even the self, which is the ultimate reality, is inconceivable, unimaginable, and inexplicable in words. As Rumi said, God's language is silence, everything else is a poor translation. And then, of course, even he never shut up after that.
Yeah.
But notwithstanding that, I sometimes playfully imagine that my body is a modified instrument looking out of an infinite spaceship from a particular window. And that even my body is the vrittis that allow me to sit at this particular window in this infinite, borderless, formless spaceship, looking at this particular scenery at this particular time period, and recognizing that there's nothing real about it. And for some inexplicable reason, that used to be nihilistic in the past, and now it's liberating, that I am independent of the vrittis I'm generating, because they come and go anyway, and there's nothing you can do to hold on to them. So might as well relax and let it be. So, it's very liberating to understand that we are independent at the most fundamental level of the vrittis that are generated, not that we generate, that we experience as our mind, as our body, and as our experience of the world. Now, modern cosmology says there are 2 trillion galaxies, 700 sextillion stars, uncountable, possibly habitable planets based on modern, cosmological observations and math. But, my response to that internally is, doesn't make a difference. A dream is a dream, whether it's a big one or a small one. It's still a dream, So do you want to share the 5 interpretations, or should we leave it another time? Because we're getting close to our limit. This has been very important anyway. What you've said so far has been very clear and very helpful.
Yeah, we could share them in a very brief format.
Let's do that.
Yeah, and I've got them written here. Should I share my screen so they're easy to follow?
Please do. And I have the book also over here. So they're all in the book anyway. I'm encouraging readers, our listeners, to watch that. But go ahead. This is beautiful. Go ahead.
Yeah. So these are the various alternative translations of that first sutra according to the author himself. So this is very important. It's not according to Harish. It's according to the original master, the original sage who revealed the sutra, he says you can interpret it in these 5 ways. And let's just contemplate them. Even without commentary, we can contemplate them, and they're very deep. So, chitti swatantra vishva siddhi hetuhu. Awareness, needing nothing outside itself, is the cause of the manifestation of all things. Interpretation number 2. Awareness of its own accord is the cause of the ultimate fulfillment of all things and all beings. So it's only through awareness that we experience the fulfillment of liberation, what we call liberation or awakening. Then third interpretation, autonomous awareness is the source of all attainments, not just spiritual awakening, but everything that we attain in life can only be possible through autonomous awareness. Fourth interpretation, and this is the key, autonomous awareness can be accessed or realized through the experience of anything whatsoever, through any experience. That may require some explanation. We could save that for next time. Fifth interpretation, awareness voluntarily causes all things to become what they are.
So, Harish, that is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We should talk about that fourth interpretation at some time. It's my experience right now that I can get to that place directly by looking at any object or any thought or any idea. I want to leave today's conversation. Recently, I had a conversation with the Nobel laureate in physics. He's credited with possibly identifying one of the particles that may theoretically be responsible for dark matter, etc. MIT professor, brilliant, amazing person. And,
what's his name?
His name is Wilczek.
Yeah.
He's brilliant. And he's also very humble, by the way, for a scientist, academic scientist. So in his conversation and in his book, which I've read, he says that the fundamental truth, scientific truth of the physical universe are 3 entities. And he calls them spin, charge, and mass. These are the fundamental properties, fundamental units of everything in the physical universe: spin, charge, and mass. But then he goes on to say that they have no location in space-time. They're totally dimensionless. And so as he was explaining this to me, I realized that spin, charge, and mass could be maybe analogous to sattva, rajas, and tamas, which are the basic principles of creation. And of course, in the Bhagavad Gita, we are told by Lord Krishna, go beyond the 3 gunas. So I want to just plant that seed in you: spin, charge, mass, or mass is inertia, of course, maybe sattva, rajas, tamas. And then this fourth interpretation that you can look at anything, any experience, and go back to the source. And I'm very grateful for the conversation today.
And just super briefly on that point, super briefly, is just that whether we're calling it spin, charge, and mass, whether we're calling it sattva, rajas, tamas, the deeper point is that consciousness manifests the universe of its experience in a patterned way, according to pattern, not randomly. And so when we look deeply into the nature of experience, we discover physical laws which were really mapping the patterned way that consciousness manifests its experience. Sure, there's some randomness, there's a little bit of randomness built into the pattern, but that's part of how consciousness manifests reality, is that it loves patterns. And we see that when we look at galaxies and biological cells and every scale of existence, we see these beautiful patterns iterating and reiterating, because that's how consciousness is. So I think that's so worthy of celebrating, regardless of what names we give to the elements of the pattern.
Well, you compel me to share another short story with you, and it has to be short because the time is running out. I was in a debate with the most eminent self-proclaimed militant atheist, Richard Dawkins, in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And I quoted Freeman Dyson, who was a contemporary of Einstein from Princeton University. He was recently passed away in his 90s. And from his book, and Richard screamed at me. He said, Freeman couldn't have said that, and you're misquoting him. He should sue you. So I sent an email to Freeman Dyson and copied Richard Dawkins on it. I said, did I misquote you? And he said, doesn't matter whether you quoted me or not quoted me, or whether, I have no intention of suing anyone anyway. But there are 3 riddles that have occupied me my entire life. Number 1, the unpredictable movement of atoms and particles. He didn't say random, he said unpredictable. Totally different. Mm-hmm. Number 2, a universe fine-tuned for mind and life. And number 3, our own consciousness. And then in his extreme humility, for such a brilliant man, he said, I don't know the answers to these 3 riddles, but I have a feeling they have something to do with each other. So I've preserved that email, and it shows the humility of one of the greatest scientists of our time as well.
So beautiful.